Sparta, land of discipline, steel, and silence. A city where weakness had no place, where children were trained to become warriors or die trying. But among all the soldiers Sparta forged, there was an even more feared elite. They weren't just the best fighters, they were the chosen 300. Men hand-picked one by one, not for wealth or name, but for virtue, strength, and resolve. Warriors who didn't just defend the city. They protected the king himself. This is not the story of the Spartan army. It's the story of its purest and deadliest core, of those who marched at the front of the phalanx, where danger was greatest and honor highest, of men who stood firm even when death was certain. Who were these 300, really? What set them apart from the rest? And why did their story vanish with the fall of Sparta? Stay with us, because you're about to meet the soldiers who couldn't afford to fail, the Spartan Royal Guard. To understand the Spartan Royal Guard, we must first understand Sparta itself, not as we see it in movies or comics, but as a real city with a complex history, built on conquest, control, and one obsession: survival. The story of Sparta begins in the Eurotas Valley, a fertile region in the southern Peloponnese. There, near the end of the Bronze Age, several agricultural communities emerged and gradually unified into a single urban center. This process, known as Noecism, gave birth to the polis of Sparta. But unlike other Greek cities, Sparta didn't develop through trade or culture. It grew through conquest. As early as the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Sparta launched military campaigns against its neighbors, first within the Laconian Valley and later across the Taygetus Mountains to invade the fertile land of Messenia. It was there that Sparta revealed its true face, that of a militaristic polis. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they subdued, enslaved, and reorganized their entire social structures. The conquered peoples were turned into helots, state-owned slaves who worked the land to feed Spartan citizens. This allowed the military elite to dedicate themselves entirely to training and warfare, while the helots produced the food. This system, however, was inherently unstable. The helots were the majority, and their resentment was constant. Sparta lived under the perpetual threat of rebellion. To prevent internal cracks, the state imposed a radical reform of its society. Tradition attributes this reform to a semi-legendary figure named Lycurgus, though today it's seen as a gradual process. Either way, the result was clear: a city entirely designed for war. Luxury, trade, and foreign currency were banned. A mandatory education system called the Agoge was instituted, where all male citizens were trained from age 7 in discipline, endurance, and combat. The idea of the homoioi, or equals, was established, a closed class of citizen warriors who were expected to look, act, and fight as one. There was no room for individuality, only for efficiency. Sparta didn't just build soldiers, it built cogs in a military machine. Militarily, this change was profound. Instead of improvised armies like in its early days, Sparta created a militia of hoplites, heavily armed warriors who fought in tight formation, the famous phalanx. From then on, every citizen was also a soldier, and war became a civic duty, not a choice. In this context of total transformation, the need emerged for an elite within the elite, a special unit selected not for wealth, like the old aristocratic cavalry, but for physical and moral excellence, a guard that would always stand beside the king on the front line of battle. Thus, the Spartan Royal Guard was born, not as a decorative symbol, but as the final wall between the king and death. In Sparta's early days, military power was closely tied to wealth. Those who could afford a horse, a spear, and armor held the top positions on the battlefield. These aristocratic warriors, known as hippias, literally horsemen, formed the upper class of the army. They rode to battle on horseback and then fought on foot as hoplites, equipped with luxurious gear that reflected their status. But as the Spartan system evolved, wealth ceased to be the main criterion for military honor. In a society that valued external equality, luxury became frowned upon. And more importantly, true worth was measured by virtue, endurance, and obedience to the state. That's when the hippies stopped being just wealthy horsemen, and the term came to mean something else entirely. The Spartan Royal Guard, a special force of 300 soldiers, selected annually from the finest young citizens, who would accompany the king into battle and form his personal line of defense. They were not a ceremonial unit. They were the men to whom the king entrusted his life. How were they selected? When a group of young Spartan citizens, called Spartiates, reached the age of 20, they became eligible for military service. At that point, the ephors, a kind of supervisory magistrate of the state, appointed 3 special officers, known as epagratai, tasked with choosing the 300 members of the guard. Each hippogreet selected 100 men, but he couldn't do so arbitrarily. Every choice had to be justified before the ephors, explaining why that citizen deserved the honor. This made the selection process highly competitive and rigorous. And if that wasn't enough, those who weren't chosen would often publicly challenge members of the guard to hand-to-hand combat, hoping to prove their superiority and earn a place the following year. These fights became so frequent and intense that the state had to regulate them with specific laws. Being part of the Royal Guard wasn't just an honor, it was a constant test of excellence. Young units, not veterans. Interestingly, the members of this unit weren't the most experienced soldiers. They were the youngest, the strongest, the most disciplined, but also the least battle-hardened. And that was intentional. The Guard was meant to shape the future leaders of the Spartan army. Serving in the Guard meant more than protecting the king. It was an elite school within the Spartan military system, where these men were expected to lead by example, encourage endurance and discipline. In other Greek cities, honor was reserved for the wealthy. In Sparta, honor was earned through sweat, struggle, and obedience. And while all of Spartan society was geared for war, the Royal Guard stood at the very peak of that martial pyramid. If anything set the Spartans apart on the battlefield beyond their courage, it was their uniform and imposing appearance. And within that collective image, the Royal Guard represented the visual perfection of the Spartan warrior. The Spartan hoplite, essential equipment. Like all Spartan hoplites, the members of the Royal Guard were armed with the traditional Greek heavy infantry gear. They didn't carry more or better weapons than their fellow soldiers. External equality was a fundamental principle in Sparta, but their presence stood out for their discipline, bearing, and tight formation. Their defense began with the ultimate symbol of the hoplite, the aspes, a large, round, and curved shield roughly 90 centimeters, about 3 feet in diameter, made from layered wood, covered in leather and rimmed with bronze. This shield wasn't just protection. It was a tactical tool in the phalanx formation. On the shield sat their most recognizable emblem, the letter lambda, standing for Lacedaemonia, the traditional name of Sparta. This image, a gleaming bronze shield marked with a lambda, became an icon of Spartan unity and terror. In addition to the shield, they carried the classic dory, a spear about 2 meters long, with an iron tip on one end and a bronze spike on the other. It was their main weapon in close combat, and its effectiveness relied on coordination within the formation. As a backup weapon, they might carry a short sword, like the curved kopis, or more commonly, the straight, double-edged xiphos. Spartans were proud of their shorter swords, claiming they fought so close to the enemy that long blades weren't necessary. The red cloak, a symbol of discipline. In earlier centuries, soldiers could choose their own colors and decorations. But over time, Sparta standardized its warrior's appearance. The use of a red tunic was imposed on all hoplites, including the Royal Guard. The color was no accident. Red helped conceal the blood from wounds, but more importantly, it projected an image of ferocity and uniformity. There was no distinction between one soldier and another. They were all the same, all part of a compact, disciplined, and terrifying force. For the enemy, looking ahead and seeing hundreds of gleaming shields, aligned spears, and red tunics advancing in unison was like facing a human wall that would not stop. Evolution of the gear. Over time, Sparta, like the rest of Greece, began to lighten its gear. The old bronze cuirasses were replaced by more flexible and economical armor, like the linothorax, made from hardened layers of linen. The heavy, closed Corinthian helmets gave way to lighter and more open designs, such as a pilos, a simple, conical helmet that exposed the face and allowed easier breathing. Leg armor, or greaves, became less common, and overall armor was reduced. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but of a new approach to warfare. Greater mobility, less weight, but the same iron will. Despite these changes, the Royal Guard maintained its essence, to be the living image of the Spartan ideal. In Sparta, war was not a profession. It was a way of life, and the men of the Royal Guard were, supposedly, the highest expression of that life. Recruitment, the 300 of the year. Each year, when young Spartiates turned 20, the selection process for the Royal Guard began. The ephors, responsible for civil governance, appointed 3 epagratai, officers in charge of selecting 100 men each, thus forming the king's 300 soldiers. The selection was demanding. Physical fitness alone wasn't enough. Candidates had to demonstrate character, discipline, competitiveness, and absolute obedience to the system. Every decision had to be justified before the ephors, which added pressure to the process. And as we mentioned earlier, those who weren't chosen didn't give up easily. They would often challenge members of the guard to fights, trying to prove their superiority and earn consideration in the future. These confrontations became so frequent that it was necessary to regulate them by law, even establishing fines if no one intervened to stop them. The position wasn't just a privilege. It was a constant responsibility, one that could be challenged every single day. Training. The Agoge's foundation. Although we don't have specific records of the Royal Guard's internal training, we do know that its members came directly from the most feared educational system of the ancient world. The Agoge. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and educated by the state. For more than a decade, they endured deprivation, extreme physical exercises, hand-to-hand combat, and mental conditioning. They were taught to endure pain, to obey without hesitation, to survive with the bare minimum, and to always fight as part collective. By the time they reached 20, they were ready to serve. The best among them were chosen to protect the king. In reality, the Guard was not made up of seasoned veterans with years of battlefield experience. It was an elite seedbed, young men with potential, trained to become leaders. Training focused on strength, speed, agility, and endurance. They practiced disciplines such as wrestling, running, jumping, discus throwing, and enduring hunger and cold. Interestingly, there's little evidence of formal weapons training. Sparta believed that courage and mental toughness were more important than technique. The closest thing to actual combat was training in the phalanx formation, the very heart of Spartan warfare. Combat style, order, cohesion, impact. The Royal Guard did not fight as a separate unit within the army, but as an integral part of the system. Their usual place was alongside the king, on the right flank of the battle line, the most honorable and also the most exposed position. During deployment, the Spartan army would shift from column to line with precise coordination. Since the Guard was at the front of the march, they would always end up in the most decisive position, where the initial impact was expected to tip the balance. Their role was not strategic. It was moral and symbolic, to show that the king and his Guard led by example, that the best stood at the front, and that death was no excuse for retreat. In combat, Sparta did not seek individual brilliance. What mattered was teamwork, an impenetrable wall of shields, uniform advance, silence, and obedience. The Royal Guard was not invincible, but their mere presence lifted Spartan morale and demoralized the enemy. Throughout its history, Sparta took part in some of the most decisive battles of the Greek world. And although it is rarely mentioned directly, the Royal Guard was there, marching beside the king, facing the worst of combat, the 300 at Thermopylae. One of the most famous episodes is the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. when King Leonidas marched with 300 Spartans to resist a Persian invasion. For centuries, it has been assumed that these 300 were the Royal Guard. However, one detail raises doubts. It is said that the men chosen were fathers of male children, meaning they would have been at least 30 years old, while the Guard was selected from young men of 20. Were they active members of the Guard? Former members? A special version? No one knows for sure. But the spirit of the Hippias, courage, obedience, and sacrifice, was undoubtedly present that day. Confirmed participation, Mantinea and Leuctra. The first certain mention of the Royal Guard in battle appears during the Peloponnesian War, at the Battle of Mantinea, 418 BCE. There, the Spartans, led by King Agis II, executed an impressive maneuver that saved the army's left flank and secured victory. The Royal Guard played a key role in that tactical turnaround, holding their ground while the rest of the line maneuvered to encircle the enemy. Decades later, in 371 BCE, the Guard would have its last great performance at the Battle of Leuctra. Sparta, still powerful, was caught off guard by the new tactics of Theban commander Epaminondas, who concentrated his entire army against the flank where the Spartan king and his guard were positioned. The blow was devastating. The king fell, the Guard was annihilated, and with them, Sparta's hegemony fell as well. The decline. After Leuctra, the Royal Guard never appeared again in historical records. Perhaps it was restored symbolically, or perhaps it was dissolved forever. What is certain is that Sparta entered a slow but irreversible decline. As the citizen population shrank, it was no longer possible to maintain an elite without weakening the rest of the army. Even later reform attempts, such as those of Agis IV or Cleomenes III, failed to restore the lost glory. The Royal Guard, like Sparta itself, became a victim of its own closed system. It stopped adapting. And like everything in history, those who don't change disappear. The story of the king's chosen 300 is not just that of a group of warriors. It's a story of society that bet everything on war, discipline, and obedience. A story of honor and also of downfall. Because even the strongest, the most feared, the most disciplined are not eternal.